The silence that fell over the Whitmore estate that Thanksgiving night wasn't the comfortable quiet of a family satisfied after a holiday feast. It was the horrifying stillness that follows violence, when breaths are held, hearts pound against rib cages, and time itself seems suspended in disbelief. In the quiet town of Briarwood, Connecticut, a family tradition transformed into a crime scene in mere seconds. The crystal glasses still held remnants of expensive wine. The turkey, carved with precision earlier that evening, lay abandoned on fine china. Anne Veronica Whitmore, who had stood her ground and refused to offer an apology she didn't believe she owed, now lay motionless on the dining room floor. What transforms a seemingly perfect marriage into murder? What pushes a respected businessman to cross the line from controlled anger to deadly rage? And how does a holiday celebration become the perfect backdrop for the culmination of years of hidden resentment? What turns a celebratory family dinner into the final chapter of a marriage? In Briarwood, Connecticut, a husband's demand for an apology ended with his wife's death, proving that sometimes the most dangerous tensions hide behind closed doors of seemingly perfect homes. Have you ever sat at a family gathering, smiling through gritted teeth? The weight of unspoken words hanging in the air, heavier than the aroma of holiday cooking? Perhaps you've witnessed the careful dance of conversation around sensitive subjects, or felt the temperature of a room drop when certain topics emerge. Have you noticed how holiday gatherings often force long-simmering tensions to the surface? The way a casual comment can suddenly expose years of buried resentment? The Whitmore case reveals how quickly festive occasions can become pressure cookers for relationships already strained to breaking point. Behind the mahogany doors of the Whitmore mansion, Douglas and Veronica had perfected the art of public harmony and private warfare. Their marriage, a battlefield disguised as a partnership, had weathered 15 years of power struggles, each skirmish leaving invisible scars. To neighbors and friends, they represented success, the self-made businessman and his cultured wife hosting elegant soirees in their New England estate. No one saw the control tightening like a noose around their relationship. The deadly confrontation between Douglas and Veronica Whitmore reveals a disturbing truth about domestic violence. It doesn't always announce itself with bruises. Sometimes it hides in plain sight, in controlling behaviors, in emotional manipulation, in the demand for deference disguised as respect. When Douglas raised that silver candlestick on Thanksgiving night, the act wasn't born from a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the culmination of a relationship where control had become confused with love, where submission was expected as proof of loyalty, and where one partner's dignity was sacrificed at the altar of another's ego. What happens when a woman's refusal to surrender her dignity collides with a man's unyielding demand for control? Stay with me to discover how this holiday tragedy exposes the dangerous dynamics that can hide beneath the veneer of a perfect marriage. Tonight, we examine not just how Douglas Whitmore killed his wife, but why a refused apology became the breaking point in a relationship already fractured by years of power imbalance. We'll trace the path that led to that fatal moment, from their early courtship to the subtle shifts in their marriage to the final confrontation that turned celebration into tragedy. This isn't simply a story about murder. It's about the invisible lines that, once crossed, can never be uncrossed. It's about recognizing the warning signs that so often precede violence. And it's about understanding how traditional occasions, moments meant for gratitude and togetherness, can sometimes become the perfect storm for tragedy. If you've ever felt tension beneath the surface of family gatherings, or wondered about the private reality behind public personas, hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you witnessed concerning dynamics in relationships that seemed perfect from the outside? The story of Douglas and Veronica Whitmore might have remained private, confined to courthouse records and local newspaper headlines, if not for what it teaches us about the nature of control, the value of dignity, and the devastating consequences when these forces collide. Join me as we reconstruct the events of that Thanksgiving night, piece by piece, revealing not just what happened but why it happened, and perhaps most importantly how similar tragedies might be prevented. This is True Crime Dossier. I'm your host, David, and this is Holiday Dinner Ends in Murder When Wife Refuses to Apologize to Husband. To understand the tragedy that unfolded at the Whitmore estate, we must first understand the couple at its center, not as they appeared in their final moments, but as they presented themselves to the world, and who they truly were beneath that carefully constructed exterior. From the sprawling Georgian colonial home on Maple Ridge Drive to the meticulously maintained gardens that surrounded it, everything about the Whitmore's public image spoke of success, refinement, and old money elegance. Their name appeared regularly in the society pages of the Briarwood Chronicle. Charitable donations, museum galas, hospital fundraisers. Douglas and Veronica Whitmore, pillars of the community, a power couple admired and envied in equal measure. They were the golden couple, recalls Eleanor Preston, a longtime neighbor. When they walked into a room, people noticed. Douglas in his perfectly tailored suits, Veronica with her understated elegance. They seemed to have everything figured out. The annual Whitmore holiday parties were legendary in Briarwood social circles. Invitations were coveted, the guest list carefully curated. Former guests describe elaborate decorations, catered food from exclusive restaurants, and conversations that flowed as freely as the premium champagne. These gatherings projected an image of harmony and abundance, a modern-day Camelot nestled in Connecticut's wealthy suburbs. Douglas was meticulous about these events, shares Michael Donnelly, a business associate who attended several Whitmore gatherings. Everything had to be perfect. The lighting, the music, the food. He monitored every detail. I remember him once having staff rearrange flower arrangements 3 times until they met his standards. This attention to detail, this need for perfection, wasn't simply a personality quirk. It was a fundamental aspect of Douglas Whitmore's character, one rooted in his humble beginnings. Born to a factory worker and a waitress in industrial Bridgeport, Douglas grew up watching his parents struggle paycheck to paycheck. Their apartment was small, their luxuries few. Young Douglas learned early that respect came with appearance, that power belonged to those who claimed it, and that control was necessary for survival. He told me once that he wore the same pair of shoes for 3 years in high school, says Richard Kent, Douglas's former college roommate. He polished them every night so no one would know they were falling apart. That kind of childhood shapes you, makes you determined never to show weakness. That determination propelled Douglas through a scholarship to a state university, where he studied business with single-minded focus. Classmates remember him as intensely competitive, brilliant but ruthless. His work ethic was legendary. While others partied, Douglas networked. While others slept, he studied. He graduated top of his class and secured a position at a prestigious financial firm, where his calculated risk-taking and uncompromising standards quickly marked him for advancement. By 30, he had founded Whitmore Capital, a boutique investment firm catering to wealthy clients. By 35, he had amassed enough wealth to purchase the estate in Briarwood, shedding the last visible traces of his working-class origins. But the insecurity, the need to prove himself, the fear of losing control, these remained, hidden beneath custom suits and confident smiles. Veronica Fletcher entered his life like a counterpoint melody, similar in some ways, dramatically different in others. Raised in a middle-class academic household with professor parents, Veronica grew up surrounded by books, ideas, and intellectual debate. Her childhood home may not have featured crystal chandeliers, but it offered something Douglas's hadn't: the freedom to question, to disagree, to develop her own voice. Veronica was always intellectually fearless, remembers her college friend, Jessica Winters. She challenged professors in class not to show off, but because she genuinely wanted to understand different perspectives. She never backed down from a thoughtful argument. With degrees in art history and literature, Veronica worked as a museum curator when she met Douglas at a gallery opening. She wasn't impressed by his wealth or status, a refreshing change for a man accustomed to deference. Instead, she challenged his opinions on the exhibited art, engaging him in a passionate debate that left him intrigued and slightly off balance. Their courtship was intense and swift. Friends describe it as a meeting of opposites who somehow complemented each other perfectly. His pragmatism balanced by her idealism, his focus on appearances matched with her appreciation for substance, his need for control temporarily softened by her independent spirit. Those early days, they were electric together, says Thomas Reeves, who attended their wedding. The way they looked at each other, it was passionate, almost combative, but in a way that seemed to energize them both. They challenged each other. You got the sense they were equals in a game only they fully understood. Their wedding was featured in Connecticut Lifestyle magazine, a lavish affair at the Botanical Gardens with 400 guests and a reception that lasted until dawn. In photographs, they appear radiant. Douglas looking at Veronica with possessive pride, Veronica gazing back with confident affection. No one could have predicted how that passion would curdle, how that pride would harden into something darker. The first years of marriage brought genuine happiness. Veronica breathed life into the austere Whitmore mansion, filling it with art, books, and vibrant conversation. Douglas, for his part, seemed to relax slightly in her presence, allowing glimpses of vulnerability rarely seen by others. Together they built a life that appeared perfect from every angle. But beneath the surface, fundamental differences were taking root. Douglas's need for control, temporarily dormant during courtship, reasserted itself in subtle ways. What began as protective concern, calling to check on Veronica's whereabouts, offering opinions on her friendships, gradually shifted into something more restrictive. I noticed changes around year 3, Jessica Winters recalls. Veronica started canceling our lunch dates. When we did meet, she'd check her phone constantly, worried about getting home late. She laughed it off, saying Douglas was just a worrier, but I saw how her shoulders tensed when his name appeared on her caller ID. As Douglas's business expanded, so did his expectation that Veronica would play a specific role, the impeccable corporate wife, an extension of his brand. Initially, she adapted, leaving her museum position to manage their social calendar and charitable endeavors. But her independent nature hadn't disappeared, it had merely retreated, waiting for space to reassert itself. You'd see these moments at parties, Eleanor Preston remembers. Douglas would be holding court, and Veronica would make some comment, intelligent, slightly contrary to his point. A flash of something would cross his face. He'd recover quickly, laugh it off, but you could feel the temperature change. By their 5th anniversary, the golden couple had established a pattern that would define the next decade of their marriage. Public harmony, private discord. Douglas demanded perfection. Veronica increasingly resisted his control. He required admiration. She sought authentic connection. He needed to win. She refused to continually lose. Their arguments, hidden from public view, grew more frequent. What had once been passionate debates evolved into cold standoffs, with Douglas leveraging his financial power and Veronica wielding her intellectual independence. Neither would yield, and the space between them widened with each confrontation. Yet to the outside world, the facade remained flawless. They still hosted the parties, attended the galas, and supported the right causes. They still posed for photographs, his hand possessively at the small of her back, her smile practiced and poised. The perfect couple in their perfect home, living their perfect lives. Until that Thanksgiving night when the facade finally shattered, revealing the broken reality it had concealed for so long. As the years passed, the distance between the Whitmores' public image and private reality widened into a chasm. What began as occasional disagreements evolved into a pattern of control and resistance that defined their marriage. Understanding this progression is crucial to comprehending how a holiday dinner could end in violence. Douglas's need for control manifested in increasingly restrictive ways. Financial decisions provided his first avenue of dominance. Though Veronica had inherited a modest sum from her grandparents, Douglas insisted on merging all accounts under his management. He established a monthly allowance for Veronica. Generous by most standards, but a clear message about power dynamics in their relationship. He would review her expenses line by line, reveals Caroline Harding, Veronica's former assistant. Questions about every coffee shop charge, every bookstore purchase. He framed it as financial responsibility, but it was surveillance, plain and simple. This financial control extended to career opportunities. When Veronica was offered a prestigious curatorial position at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, Douglas vetoed the idea, citing the commute as impractical, and suggesting the role would interfere with her duties as his wife. The museum position, a dream opportunity, was declined with regret. That was a turning point, says Jessica Winters. She'd been so excited about that job offer. After she turned it down, something changed in her eyes, a light dimmed. She stopped mentioning career aspirations altogether. Douglas's control extended to their social circle. Friends noticed how couples they spent time with were increasingly connected to his business interests rather than mutual enjoyment. Veronica's college friends found themselves excluded from gatherings. Her family visits became less frequent, always with explanations about Douglas's busy schedule making extended stays inconvenient. Even Veronica's appearance became subject to Douglas's approval. Though never directly demanding changes, he mastered the art of subtle critique, commenting when certain clothes didn't flatter her, or suggesting different hairstyles would be more appropriate for upcoming events. Photographs over the years show her style shifting from eclectic and artistic to conservative and polished, a visual record of her diminishing self-expression. I remember a Christmas party where she wore this beautiful vintage dress, recalls Eleanor Preston. Bold colors, unique design, very Veronica. Douglas kept introducing her as, my wife who decided to make a statement tonight. Each time his tone grew colder. She changed before dinner was served. Perhaps most insidious was his control over her narrative. Douglas frequently spoke for Veronica in social settings, interrupted her stories to clarify details, and sometimes contradicted her memories of shared experiences. This subtle undermining eroded her confidence and reshaped her self-perception. He would correct her pronunciation of words, challenge her recollection of events, says Michael Donnelly. Always with a smile, always framed as helpful. But you could see her shrinking with each correction. Yet despite these mounting pressures, Veronica developed subtle forms of resistance. Small acts of defiance that preserved her sense of self amid Douglas's tightening control. Her art collection became one sanctuary. While Douglas dominated the main rooms of their estate with traditional landscapes and hunting scenes, Veronica curated a private gallery in her study, abstract works, feminist pieces, and provocative modern art that Douglas dismissed as pretentious nonsense. These selections, hidden from public view, represented her quiet rebellion. Those paintings were her true voice, explains Amelia Chin, an art dealer who worked with Veronica. She spoke about them with passion I rarely saw otherwise. They represented freedom, ideas and emotions Douglas couldn't control or dismiss. Veronica also maintained secret friendships, connections cultivated during her museum days that survived through clandestine lunches and encrypted messages. These relationships provided honest conversation and emotional support absent from her marriage. Her reading choices reflected another form of resistance. Her personal library grew to include feminist theory, psychology texts on emotional abuse, and memoirs of women who had reclaimed their autonomy. These books, discovered after her death, revealed a woman educating herself about her circumstances while searching for escape routes. Most significantly, Veronica kept a journal, hundreds of pages documenting incidents of control, manipulation, and emotional abuse. Written in elegant, measured prose, these entries reveal her growing awareness of her situation alongside her determination to maintain her dignity. "I will not become invisible," she wrote 6 months before her death. "I cannot leave yet, the cost is too high. But I refuse to disappear completely. My thoughts remain my own. My inner life is still mine." As these patterns intensified, those close to the couple began noticing warning signs. Family members recall uncomfortable moments during holiday gatherings, Douglas's rage when dinner was delayed, his cold treatment when Veronica engaged others in conversation without including him. "There was an incident at Easter," remembers Veronica's cousin Mark Fletcher. Veronica mentioned applying for a part-time teaching position at the community college. Douglas's face transformed completely. He didn't raise his voice, but the look he gave her, it was chilling. She immediately changed the subject and didn't mention working again. Friends observed concerning dynamics during social events. Douglas would joke about Veronica's flaws, gauge her reaction, then accuse her of being too sensitive if she objected. He developed elaborate systems to monitor her whereabouts, calling repeatedly during her rare outings alone, questioning friends about her activities, even having his assistant coincidentally appear at locations where Veronica was meeting others. "I ran into them at a restaurant where Douglas arrived unexpectedly during our lunch," says Jessica Winters. He claimed he just happened to be nearby, but Veronica's face told a different story. She looked frightened, then resigned. She stopped scheduling lunches with me after that. Even staff at the Whitmore estate witnessed troubling behaviors. Household employees noted Douglas's explosive anger when expectations weren't met, followed by calculated periods of silence and withdrawal. They described Veronica walking on eggshells, attempting to anticipate his moods and adjust accordingly. "The house operated on his emotional weather," says former housekeeper Marta Jimenez. "Everyone monitored his expressions, his tone, for signs of displeasure. Ms. Veronica most of all. She could sense shifts before anyone else, a survival skill she developed." Do these patterns sound familiar to you? Have you witnessed friends or family members whose personalities seem to diminish in their relationships? Whose partners speak for them, criticize them publicly, or monitor their activities? These aren't simply personality quirks, they're warning signs of control and emotional abuse. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you recognize these patterns in your own life or someone close to you, remember, reaching out for help is an act of courage, not betrayal. Like and subscribe to join our community working to identify these dangerous dynamics before they escalate. As the Whitmores approached their 15th anniversary, the balance between control and resistance had reached a critical point. Douglas, sensing Veronica's growing determination to reclaim her autonomy, intensified his monitoring and criticism. Veronica, strengthened by her secret support network and increasing clarity about her situation, became less willing to surrender her dignity for peace. The stage was set for conflict. All that remained was the catalyst, A moment that would transform long-simmering tension into deadly violence. That catalyst would arrive with the Thanksgiving turkey, carved with precision at a table set for destruction. November in Connecticut brings a particular quality of light, crisp, clear, and fleeting. By mid-afternoon, shadows lengthen across manicured lawns, and early darkness settles over even the grandest estates. In the Whitmore household, Thanksgiving preparations began weeks in advance, with Douglas insisting on a level of precision that transformed what should have been a warm family gathering into something closer to a military operation. The planning binder was 3 inches thick, recalls Marta Jimenez, who had worked as the Whitmore's housekeeper for over a decade. Mr. Whitmore required daily updates on everything: menu revisions, guest confirmations, seating arrangements, wine pairings. Nothing was left to chance. This particular Thanksgiving carried additional weight. Douglas had recently secured a major client whose portfolio would significantly expand Whitmore Capital's influence. Several key business associates would be among the 22 guests, and Douglas viewed the dinner as partly social, partly a business opportunity, a chance to showcase not just his hospitality but the perfect life he had constructed. He kept saying everything needed to be flawless, says Robert Chin, the caterer hired for the event. Not excellent or outstanding, flawless. He used that exact word at least 15 times during our final meeting. For Veronica, the approaching holiday represented something entirely different. Her journal entries from early November reveal a woman at a crossroads, gathering resolve for some significant change. "I cannot continue this way much longer," she wrote 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. "The constant vigilance, the walking on eggshells, the performance of happiness, it's destroying me from within. After the holidays, decisions must be made. I deserve more than survival." The morning of Thanksgiving dawned cold and bright. Staff arrived at 6 a.m. to begin preparations. Douglas was already awake, reviewing the day's schedule, making calls to confirm final details. Veronica appeared later, outwardly calm but tense around the eyes, a woman conserving energy for the performance ahead. Her outfit, a burgundy dress with subtle gold embroidery, had been selected weeks earlier with Douglas's approval. Her jewelry was minimal but expensive, her makeup flawless yet understated. Even her hairstyle struck the careful balance Douglas preferred. Elegant but not attention-seeking, sophisticated without being showy. She looked beautiful but contained, remembers Elena Vasquez, the makeup artist who arrived that morning. Like a work of art displayed behind glass, perfect but untouchable. As staff completed final preparations, Veronica moved through the house with practiced efficiency, adjusting flower arrangements, straightening place cards, reviewing the music playlist. Douglas followed close behind, finding small faults. A centerpiece slightly off-center, water spots on crystal glasses, the temperature of the dining room 1 degree too cool. Their interaction that morning was all subtext, Elena continues. He would point out some minor issue and she would fix it without comment. No argument but no warmth either. Just this cold efficiency between them. The tension was, you could feel it catching in your throat. The first guests arrived at 4 p.m. sharp. Douglas's parents, now in their 70s. Harold Whitmore, a retired factory worker whose rough hands contrasted with his expensive suit, and Margaret Whitmore, a woman who had exchanged her waitress uniform for designer clothes but never quite shed her wariness around wealth. They brought homemade cranberry sauce, a family tradition that Douglas allowed with barely concealed disdain. That cranberry sauce was her one rebellion, Harold would later tell investigators. Margaret knew Douglas preferred the gourmet stuff, but she brought hers anyway. Small way of reminding him where he came from. Next came Veronica's side, her brother Daniel with his wife and teenage children. The Fletcher family brought a different energy, more relaxed, more talkative, less concerned with appearances. Daniel embraced his sister tightly, holding on a beat longer than customary. Later, he would describe noticing something fragile in her eyes that concerned him. Business associates and their spouses arrived in quick succession, each greeted by the Whitmores with identical welcoming smiles that never quite reached their eyes. Douglas guided conversations with practiced skill, highlighting Veronica's charitable work, their recent European vacation, and the prestigious schools their nephews and nieces attended. By 5 p.m., all guests had gathered in the grand living room for cocktails and appetizers. The scene appeared perfect. Fires crackling in marble fireplaces, staff circulating with trays of hors d'oeuvres, conversation flowing as smoothly as the expensive bourbon. Yet those paying close attention noted the performance quality of it all. The way Douglas positioned himself to monitor all interactions, how Veronica's laughter sounded rehearsed, the careful distance maintained between husband and wife. The inciting incident, the match to dry kindling, occurred at precisely 5:37 p.m. Later, multiple witnesses would confirm the timing, having checked their phones after sensing the shift in atmosphere. Douglas was deep in conversation with Walter Harrington, the potential client whose business he coveted. Veronica stood nearby, part of the circle but slightly peripheral, nodding at appropriate intervals. The discussion turned to market predictions for the coming year, with Douglas offering confident assessments of various sectors. "I believe technology remains overvalued," Douglas stated, swirling his scotch. "My firm has been shifting clients toward more conservative positions since August." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting approach. What's your take, Veronica? Do you share your husband's conservative outlook?" The question, directed at Veronica rather than Douglas, created a momentary disruption in the carefully choreographed evening. Douglas's posture stiffened imperceptibly as all eyes turned to his wife. Veronica paused, taking a deliberate sip of her wine before responding. "Actually, I've been reading about emerging markets in sustainable energy. Several analyses suggest significant growth potential there, despite current volatility." Her response, knowledgeable, measured, and contrary to Douglas's position, landed like a slap. Walter appeared intrigued, asking follow-up questions that Veronica answered with growing confidence and animation. For several minutes, she commanded the conversation while Douglas stood silent, his knuckles whitening around his glass. "It was like watching someone step out of a straitjacket," Daniel Fletcher later described. For those few minutes, the real Veronica emerged, intelligent, insightful, alive. "I remember feeling both proud and terrified for her." The moment passed when Douglas smoothly interjected, guiding the conversation back to safer territory with practiced charm. But something had shifted. His smile remained fixed, his hospitality impeccable, but those closest to him recognized the cold fury building behind his eyes. As guests moved to the dining room, Douglas grasped Veronica's elbow with what appeared to be husbandly affection. Those nearest heard his whispered words, "We'll discuss your expertise later." The dining room presented a vision of traditional elegance. A massive mahogany table gleaming under chandelier light, fine china and crystal at each setting, autumn-themed centerpieces spaced with mathematical precision. Seating had been strategically arranged to facilitate specific conversations, with Douglas at the head and Veronica at the foot. Maximum distance between them. Throughout the multi-course meal, tension accumulated like static electricity before a storm. Douglas dominated conversations, repeatedly referencing our position and what we believe when discussing business or politics. His linguistic assertion of unity effectively erasing Veronica's earlier independent stance. When Veronica contributed to discussions, Douglas developed a pattern of response. Initial patience, followed by subtle undermining. What Veronica means to say, he would interject, or, "That's my wife's artistic perspective but in practical terms." Each correction delivered with a smile, each qualification wrapped in apparent affection. It was death by 1,000 cuts, Walter Harrington later reflected. Each time she spoke, he would let her finish, then essentially translate her thoughts into his own words, as if her original expression was somehow inadequate. By the time turkey was served, Veronica had grown increasingly quiet, responding to direct questions but initiating nothing. Witnesses described her as withdrawing into herself as the meal progressed. The secondary trigger occurred during dessert. Margaret Whitmore, perhaps loosened by wine or concerned by the dynamics she observed, began reminiscing about Veronica's early days with the family. "I remember when you first started dating Douglas," she said warmly. "You challenged him constantly, argued politics, art, everything. Never seen anyone stand up to my son that way. It was refreshing." The comment hung in the air like frost. Douglas's smile remained fixed, but something cold and dangerous moved behind his eyes. "People change, mother," he replied evenly. "Veronica has learned the value of supporting her husband rather than challenging him. Haven't you, dear?" The question demanded a particular response. Affirmation of his narrative, acknowledgement of her proper role. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward Veronica, waiting. She set her dessert fork down carefully, the small clink against fine china audible in the sudden silence. When she looked up, something had changed in her expression. A resolve that had been building for years suddenly crystallized. "Actually, Douglas," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "I haven't learned that at all. I've simply grown tired of having my thoughts dismissed or corrected. But I haven't changed. I've just been muted." The words themselves were mild, but their delivery, calm, clear, and unapologetic, represented a fundamental challenge to Douglas's authority in front of the very people whose respect he craved most. Conversation stuttered, then resumed with forced cheerfulness as guests sensed the dangerous currents but chose to ignore them. Douglas maintained his host persona, though those seated nearby noticed how he gripped his knife, the whiteness of his knuckles, the mechanical precision of his movements. As coffee was served, Douglas suggested the men might enjoy cigars in his study while the women gathered in the living room, a deliberately old-fashioned division that several guests found awkward but none challenged. Before leaving the table, Douglas leaned down as if to kiss Veronica's cheek, whispering instead, "My office. 10 minutes. We need to discuss your behavior." She nodded once, neither agreeing nor refusing, her face composed. Only her brother, watching closely from across the table, noticed the slight tremor in her hand as she raised her coffee cup. What happened next would transform a family holiday into a crime scene and reveal how years of controlled tension can explode into sudden, irreversible violence. 10 minutes stretched to 15 as Veronica remained seated at the dining table, now empty except for staff clearing dishes. She traced the rim of her coffee cup, her reflection distorted in the dark liquid. In the distance, male laughter filtered from Douglas's study, while female voices murmured in the living room. She belonged in neither space at that moment, suspended between obligations and something else, something still taking shape. When she finally rose and walked toward Douglas's office, her steps were measured. Not hurried with apology, not dragging with reluctance, simply deliberate. She knocked once and entered without waiting for permission, a small assertion of equality that didn't go unnoticed. Douglas stood by the window, silhouetted against the darkness outside. The other men had departed, leaving the study with its leather-bound books and hunting trophies as the private stage for what would follow. He didn't turn immediately, forcing her to wait, one of his familiar tactics to establish dominance. "Close the door," he said finally, his voice controlled yet tight, like a violin string tuned too high. Security footage later recovered from the study, installed by Douglas himself to protect his valuables, captured the 18 minutes that followed. This silent footage, combined with audio from Douglas's inadvertently activated phone recording app, provides a chilling document of their final confrontation. Douglas began with cold precision, outlining Veronica's transgressions like a prosecutor building a case. Her contradiction of his market assessment, her failure to support his positions, her inappropriate revelation of marital tensions at the dinner table. "You embarrassed me tonight," he said, pacing methodically. "After 15 years, you still don't understand your role. When Walter asked for your opinion, the correct response was to support my position." Veronica stood motionless, arms at her sides. "Walter asked what I thought, not what you thought. I gave him my honest assessment." "Your assessment?" Douglas's laugh held no humor. "Based on what? Some articles you've skimmed? These are my clients, my business relationships. Your job is to enhance my credibility, not undermine it. I'm your wife, Douglas. Not your employee, not your asset." Her voice remained steady. "I have my own mind, my own thoughts." He moved closer, invading her personal space, another control tactic. "When we're in public, especially with my clients, we present a united front. That's the agreement. An agreement requires two willing participants," she countered. "I don't recall consenting to having my thoughts edited or dismissed." The exchange continued, each response escalating the tension. Douglas demanded an apology, not just for tonight but for what he termed a pattern of defiance. Veronica refused, each denial stripping away another layer of his carefully constructed authority. Dr. Rachel Kendrick, forensic psychologist who later analyzed the case, explains why this particular confrontation became the breaking point. What we see in this interaction is a fundamental challenge to Douglas's identity. His entire self-concept was built around control and authority. Each time Veronica refused to apologize, she wasn't just declining to say words, she was rejecting the foundation of how he understood himself and their relationship. The recording captures the precise moment when Douglas's control fractured. After several minutes of increasingly heated exchange, Veronica delivered the statement that would prove fatal. "I've spent 15 years apologizing for existing as a separate person from you," she said quietly. "I won't do it anymore. Not tonight, not tomorrow. I'm done diminishing myself to manage your fragile ego." Douglas went still, a predatory stillness more threatening than any movement. "You need to apologize right now," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before we return to our guests." "No." The security footage shows Douglas's body language transform. shoulders squaring, hands clenching, breathing accelerated. "I won't ask again." "Good," Veronica replied, turning toward the door. "Because my answer won't change." What followed occurred in less than 10 seconds. As Veronica reached for the doorknob, Douglas grabbed a heavy silver candlestick from his desk, an antique piece with an ornate base and substantial weight. The camera captured his movement as he crossed the room in 3 rapid strides. Veronica sensed the danger and turned, raising her arm defensively. The candlestick connected with her temple with devastating force. The first blow sent her staggering against the bookcase. The second ensured she would never rise again. The recording captures Douglas's breathing, harsh, ragged, and then 16 seconds of absolute silence before he whispers, "Why couldn't you just apologize?" Dr. Kendrick explains this moment of lethal violence. This wasn't a crime of momentary passion but the culmination of a relationship defined by control. When Douglas realized he had lost absolute authority over Veronica, that she would no longer participate in the dynamic he required, violence became his final attempt to reassert dominance. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish rapidity. A staff member, hearing the commotion, opened the study door to find Veronica on the floor, blood pooling around her head, and Douglas standing over her, the candlestick still in his hand. Her scream alerted others who rushed to the scene. Daniel Fletcher, Veronica's brother, was among the first to enter. "The image is burned into my memory," he later testified. "My sister on the floor, Douglas just standing there, looking almost confused, like he couldn't understand how this had happened." Chaos erupted as guests crowded the doorway. Margaret Whitmore collapsed against her husband. Walter Harrington, displaying unexpected presence of mind, checked Veronica's pulse before instructing someone to call emergency services. Douglas remained frozen, still holding the murder weapon, his expression shifting between shock and something harder to define, perhaps the first recognition of what his need for control had ultimately cost him. Staff members attempted first aid while Daniel Fletcher physically restrained Douglas, forcing him into a chair where he sat unnaturally still, watching the frantic attempts to revive his wife with detached interest. His calmness was the most disturbing part, Walter later told investigators. While everyone else was panicking, calling for help, trying to stop the bleeding, Douglas just watched, like he was observing a mildly interesting business presentation. Emergency responders arrived 13 minutes after the attack, but Veronica Whitmore was pronounced dead at the scene. The official cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head. The murder weapon, a family heirloom that had been displayed in the Whitmore home for generations. As paramedics covered Veronica's body and police officers secured the scene, Douglas finally spoke. According to multiple witnesses, he looked at the officer handcuffing him and asked with genuine confusion, "She could have just apologized. Why wouldn't she just apologize?" In that question, asked as his wife's blood still spread across the imported carpet of his study, lay the terrible logic that had defined their marriage and ultimately ended it. The belief that maintaining his authority was worth any price, even Veronica's life. The Whitmore estate transformed from elegant home to active crime scene in minutes. Yellow police tape cut across manicured hedges. Forensic technicians in white coveralls replaced caterers in black uniforms. The warm glow of holiday lighting competed with the harsh flash of police photographers documenting every detail of the violence that had erupted amid celebration. Detective Maria Sanchez, lead investigator on the case, arrived within 30 minutes of the initial 911 call. With 15 years of homicide experience, she recognized immediately that this case would be both straightforward and complex. Straightforward in determining what happened, complex in understanding why. The physical evidence was unusually clear, Sanchez later explained in court testimony. "We had the weapon with the suspect's fingerprints, multiple witnesses, security footage, and even audio recording. What made this case challenging wasn't establishing facts but comprehending how a respected businessman could commit such violence in a house full of guests over something as seemingly minor as a refused apology." The crime scene investigation proceeded with methodical precision. Blood spatter analysis told a clear story of the attack: the angle of impact, the force used, the victim's position. Forensic technicians documented a cast-off pattern on nearby bookshelves consistent with 2 distinct strikes. The candlestick, weighing 3.2 pounds of solid silver, bore Douglas's fingerprints in a grip pattern indicating significant force. The blood spatter indicated extreme violence, testified Dr. James Morgan, forensic pathologist. The first blow caused immediate unconsciousness. The second was delivered with enough force to cause fatal cranial fractures. This wasn't a momentary loss of control, it required sustained application of force. While the crime scene itself offered compelling evidence, investigators discovered that Douglas had unwittingly created an even more damning record. The Whitmore home featured an extensive security system with cameras monitoring most rooms, including Douglas's study where the murder occurred. The security footage was remarkable in its clarity, said Assistant District Attorney Elena Rodriguez. We could see Douglas select the candlestick, approach his wife from behind, and deliver both blows. There was no struggle, no self-defense scenario. Just calculated violence when his authority was challenged. Even more revealing was an accidental audio recording from Douglas's phone. He had been using a recording app earlier that day to dictate business notes and never turned it off. The app captured the entire confrontation, including Veronica's refusal to apologize and Douglas's final question after the attack. Why couldn't you just apologize? This digital evidence provided prosecutors with a rare window into both the crime itself and the psychology behind it. The recording revealed not a man who lost control in sudden anger, but one who had made a cold calculation. If his wife would not submit to his authority, she would be punished. Beyond physical and digital evidence, investigators conducted extensive interviews with dinner guests, staff members, and the couple's wider social circle. These testimonies revealed a pattern that had been building for years before culminating in murder. Walter Harrington's statement proved particularly valuable. Throughout dinner, Douglas kept reasserting control whenever Veronica spoke. When she finally stood her ground, something changed in his demeanor. Not explosive anger, but a cold determination. Like he'd made a decision. Staff members provided crucial context about the Whitmores' daily dynamics. Elena Vasquez, the makeup artist, described how Veronica often covered faint bruises with concealer, physical evidence that the psychological abuse had already begun escalating to physical intimidation before the murder. Ms. Whitmore would ask for extra coverage on her wrists or upper arms, Elena testified. She always had explanations. Bumped into a door, clumsy accident. Looking back, the pattern was clear, but at the time, I wish I had recognized what was happening. The investigation expanded beyond the immediate crime to include financial records, email communications, and Veronica's journal. These materials revealed Douglas's systematic isolation of his wife, restricting her access to independent funds, monitoring her communications, and gradually separating her from support networks. The journal, found hidden in a compartment beneath Veronica's dressing table, documented years of emotional abuse. Her final entry, dated the morning of Thanksgiving, read, "Today I choose dignity over peace. Whatever comes, I will not apologize for existing as myself." As evidence accumulated, investigators identified a pattern familiar to domestic violence experts. A relationship defined by coercive control that escalated when the victim began asserting independence. What made the Whitmore case unusual wasn't the dynamics. These occur in countless homes, but the dramatic setting and violent conclusion. High-profile cases like this often surprise people because they challenge our assumptions about what abuse looks like, explains Dr. Lydia Montgomery, domestic violence researcher. We expect abusers to be obvious monsters and victims to be completely helpless. The reality, that abuse often occurs in wealthy homes behind perfect facades, perpetrated by respected community members, is harder to accept. Douglas Whitmore's defense team attempted to portray the murder as a momentary lapse, a temporary insanity triggered by holiday stress and alcohol. This narrative collapsed under the weight of evidence showing years of controlling behavior culminating in a calculated act of violence. The prosecution built their case around the concept of lethal male proprietariness, the belief that a man has absolute ownership over his partner, justifying violence when that ownership is challenged. They successfully argued that Douglas's actions represented not an aberration but the logical conclusion of his worldview. The warning signs were there in the Whitmore marriage long before violence erupted. How many similar situations might be unfolding right now in homes that appear perfect from the outside? If you recognize patterns we've discussed, financial control, isolation, public humiliation disguised as jokes, monitoring movements and communications, these aren't just relationship problems. They're danger signals that deserve attention. Like this video, share it with someone who might need this information, and subscribe for more content that could literally save lives. Have you noticed these warning signs in relationships around you? What made you realize something wasn't right? Share your insights in the comments below. The Whitmore investigation concluded with a comprehensive case file detailing how psychological abuse escalated to murder when a victim finally refused to participate in her own diminishment. The evidence painted a clear picture. Douglas Whitmore hadn't snapped in a moment of passion. He had coldly decided that if his wife would not submit to his authority, she had no right to exist. What began as a holiday dinner ended with one person dead and another facing life imprisonment, all because an apology was demanded but dignity was chosen instead. To understand the tragedy of the Whitmores requires looking beyond the crime itself to examine the psychological patterns that led to that fatal moment. Court-appointed psychologists conducted extensive evaluations of Douglas during his trial, while forensic psychologists reconstructed Veronica's psychological state through her journals, communications, and witness accounts. Dr. Eliza Chin, forensic psychologist who evaluated Douglas, identified key traits consistent with what psychologists term coercive controlling personalities. Her assessment revealed a man whose self-worth depended entirely on maintaining dominance. Douglas exhibited a complex combination of narcissistic and controlling traits, Dr. Chin explained. His childhood poverty created deep insecurity that he compensated for through absolute control of his environment and relationships. Any challenge to his authority registered not as disagreement but as existential threat. The psychological profile revealed Douglas's binary worldview. Interactions were categorized solely as either submissions to his will or rebellions against it. This framework made Veronica's refusal to apologize not merely frustrating but fundamentally intolerable, a complete rejection of the relationship's power structure. For men with these psychological patterns, controlling behavior isn't recognized as abuse but as their rightful position, notes Dr. Chin. Douglas genuinely believed he was entitled to Veronica's complete deference. Her refusal violated his core understanding of their relationship. Veronica's psychological profile, reconstructed posthumously, revealed a complex journey from accommodation to resistance. Early journal entries showed attempts to understand Douglas's behavior, often blaming herself for his reactions. Later writings demonstrated growing recognition of the abusive patterns and determination to preserve her core identity despite them. Veronica's psychological evolution is typical of long-term abuse survivors, explains Dr. Maya Williams, trauma specialist. She moved through distinct phases: confusion, self-blame, awakening, and finally resistance. Her refusal to apologize represented the culmination of years of internal psychological work, reclaiming her autonomy even as external freedom remained limited. The power dynamics between the Whitmores exemplified what researchers term coercive control, a pattern of behavior that strips away the victim's autonomy through isolation, monitoring, criticism, and consequences for non-compliance. Unlike relationships with occasional conflict between equals, coercively controlled relationships feature one partner systematically dominating the other. What makes these relationships particularly dangerous is their invisible nature, says Dr. Williams. Douglas didn't need to use physical violence regularly because he had established psychological control through years of smaller coercions, restricting Veronica's finances, criticizing her choices, isolating her from support networks. When traditional control methods fail, research shows abusers often escalate to violence, not as a loss of control but as an attempt to reassert it. Veronica's growing resistance threatened Douglas's authority, making violence the logical conclusion of his control strategy. The question isn't why Douglas became violent that night, explains criminologist Dr. Marcus Jensen. The question is why the violence didn't happen sooner. The answer lies in Veronica's previous compliance. As long as she operated within his parameters, even reluctantly, physical violence remained unnecessary. Holiday gatherings create particularly dangerous conditions for abusive relationships. Research indicates domestic violence reports increase significantly during holiday periods due to multiple factors: financial stress, alcohol consumption, extended family interactions, and heightened expectations for perfect celebrations. Thanksgiving represented a perfect storm of risk factors, notes Dr. Jensen. Douglas faced pressure to present an ideal family image to important business contacts. Veronica's contradicting him publicly threatened both his business interests and his self-image. Alcohol lowered inhibitions. And the holiday setting meant witnesses were present for his humiliation, magnifying his perceived loss of status. The cultural context surrounding the Whitmores' marriage created conditions where abuse could flourish unrecognized. Social expectations about gender roles, especially in wealthy conservative circles, normalized Douglas's controlling behavior as simple traditionalism, rather than identifying it as abuse. Our cultural narratives about marriage still include troubling assumptions, explains sociologist Dr. Rebecca Townsend. The idea that wives should defer to husbands, that men naturally take charge, that marriage requires compromise, often disproportionately from women, These concepts provide cover for controlling behaviors. The Whitmore case illustrates how external success and respectability often shield abusers from scrutiny. Douglas's status as a wealthy businessman created a presumption of character that deflected concerns about his private behavior. High-status abusers benefit from what we call the halo effect, says Dr. Townsend. Their professional accomplishments and social standing create an assumption of moral character that makes allegations of abuse seem implausible. This protective shield enables abuse to continue unchallenged, often for decades. Ultimately, the psychological analysis of the Whitmore case reveals a fundamental truth about domestic homicide. It rarely occurs spontaneously. The murder of Veronica Whitmore represented the final act in a long progression of control, resistance, and escalation. A tragedy years in the making, hidden behind closed doors and perfect holiday decorations until that final, fatal confrontation. The trial of Douglas Whitmore began 9 months after Thanksgiving night. The Connecticut Superior Court in New Haven became the stage for proceedings that captivated national attention, not for their mystery, but for their stark illumination of hidden abuse behind privileged facades. Prosecutors presented an overwhelming case: security footage showing the attack, audio recording of the confrontation, forensic evidence confirming the brutality of the blows, and testimony from 22 dinner guests who witnessed the controlling dynamics leading to the murder. The defense strategy, claiming temporary insanity triggered by extreme emotional distress, collapsed under cross-examination of psychological experts who identified long-standing patterns rather than momentary breakdown. Most damaging to Douglas's case was his own testimony. When questioned about why Veronica's refusal to apologize justified violence, he responded with chilling calm: "She knew the rules of our marriage. Respect was non-negotiable." This statement, delivered without apparent awareness of its implications, cemented the prosecution's portrayal of a man who believed ownership of his wife gave him the right to punish perceived disobedience. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict for first-degree murder. Judge Miranda Coleman delivered the maximum sentence: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Her sentencing statement specifically addressed the dynamics of control that led to violence. This court finds that the murder of Veronica Whitmore was the culmination of years of coercive control. Mr. Whitmore, your actions demonstrate not a momentary lapse but the logical conclusion of a worldview that prioritizes dominance over human dignity. The sentence reflects not only justice for Veronica but protection for society from your dangerous belief system. In Briarwood, the community response evolved from initial shock to deeper reckoning. The Whitmore case forced uncomfortable conversations about how easily abuse can hide behind wealth and social standing. Local domestic violence calls increased 43% in the months following the murder, not because violence had increased, but because victims recognized their situations in Veronica's story and sought help before reaching a similar endpoint. The Whitmore case shattered our illusion of safety, explained Briarwood Mayor Patricia Garcia. We had to confront the reality that domestic violence doesn't conform to socioeconomic boundaries. It exists in mansions as well as apartments, behind designer clothes as well as discount store purchases. This recognition prompted community action. The Briarwood Women's Association established the Veronica Whitmore Foundation, providing resources for domestic violence prevention and victim support. Local businesses implemented training to recognize warning signs of abuse. The school district incorporated healthy relationship education into curricula. Veronica's legacy extended beyond prevention programs. Her journal, published with her family's permission, became required reading in psychology courses studying domestic abuse. Her brother Daniel established a scholarship for women rebuilding lives after leaving controlling relationships. The security footage from the Whitmore home, with Veronica's final refusal to apologize, is now shown in police training sessions as an example of how dignity can be both an act of courage and, tragically, a catalyst for violence from abusers. Veronica's final stand wasn't just defiance, explains Dr. Williams. It was reclamation of her fundamental humanity after years of erosion. That she died for this basic assertion of selfhood reveals the lethal nature of coercive control. The story of Veronica and Douglas Whitmore illustrates how holiday gatherings can intensify dangerous relationship dynamics. If you recognize controlling behaviors in your relationship or someone else's, financial restrictions, isolation from friends and family, constant criticism, monitoring of movements or communications, please understand these as warning signs, not normal relationship challenges. Resources exist to help. The National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233 provides confidential support 24/7. Share this video to raise awareness, especially during holiday seasons when family pressures and expectations can escalate existing tensions. Your engagement could literally save someone's life. Like, subscribe, and join our community committed to recognizing these patterns before they turn deadly. In the final analysis, the Whitmore tragedy reveals fundamental truths about human relationships. Control masquerading as love destroys what it claims to protect. Dignity, once fully awakened, cannot be easily surrendered. And sometimes, the simple act of refusing to apologize for existing authentically becomes the most profound form of courage. Douglas Whitmore entered prison still believing himself the victim of his wife's defiance. Veronica Whitmore left this world having reclaimed her voice after years of enforced silence. Their final exchange, his demand for submission, her insistence on dignity, encapsulates a struggle playing out in countless homes, usually without witnesses, often without resolution, and sometimes with equally tragic consequences. The candlestick that ended Veronica's life now resides in an evidence locker. But her final words, "I'm done diminishing myself," echo as both warning and inspiration for anyone caught in the invisible cage of coercive control.